They called me paranoid, but look at this. The HOA president marched contractors onto land my parents purchased decades before her little kingdom existed. She smiled as if the place belonged to her, handed out glossy brochures, and promised a glittering future built on my property, treating me like I'd already been erased. I lay awake those nights listening to engines cross my soil, counting every headlight that passed my window, wondering how much they'd take before I snapped. Call me crazy, would you have trusted the system or fought back? Standing on my parents' old lot, I held the yellow deed from 1978. The ink had faded, but the legal language was still crystal clear. Mom and Dad bought this 3-acre plot and built their modest ranch house 17 years before Willowbrook Homeowners Association even existed. Back then this was just farmland and a few scattered homes. The HOA arrived later, in 1995, when developers began filling in the fields with cookie-cutter houses. The property boundaries were marked with old metal stakes, still visible if you knew where to look. I had mineral rights, water rights, and every square foot of dirt. Most important, the parcel was free and clear of any HOA restrictions. A lot of people don't understand how homeowner associations work. They can only govern properties that voluntarily sign their covenants, conditions, and restrictions. My land predated their authority by nearly 2 decades. I was checking the survey markers when I heard voices. Susan Peterson emerged from the tree line with a surveying crew and a county employee. She walked like someone who thought her HOA title gave her power beyond her subdivision. The surveyor was already setting up on my land without permission. The county official looked uncomfortable, probably realizing he'd been given incomplete information about the visit. Susan saw me and headed over wearing that practiced smile she used in meetings. "Mr. Grant, perfect timing. We're going to optimize this underutilized space with a community wellness center. The neighborhood needs a gathering place, don't you think?" Her tone left no room for discussion. It read as a fait accompli. I noticed she conveniently skipped who had actually authorized construction on private property. I kept my voice steady and curious. "Interesting project. Susan, do you have the building permits to construct on private land?" The surveyor paused. The county official shifted his weight. Susan dismissed the question with a wave. "HOA projects don't need individual permits. We handle community development through our board authority." That was flatly wrong. We both knew it. Before I could say more, Frank Miller called out from his yard. He'd been watching and stepped over toward us. Frank had retired from the county building department after 30 years. His voice carried the weight of someone who'd written actual permits. "That's incorrect," he said. "Every construction project needs permits, especially on private land." "Ma'am, do you have authorization from the property owner?" Frank pressed. Susan's smile tightened. She hadn't expected expert pushback so early. "I don't need authorization. I am the HOA president and this property falls under our community development guidelines." The surveyor and county official exchanged looks, even they could tell something wasn't right. Frank folded his arms and studied Susan like a permit application missing signatures. Mrs. Chen from down the street, who'd been walking her dog, stopped to watch and whispered to me, "She tried this with the Johnsons last year. They had to hire a lawyer to stop her from improving their backyard. Cost them thousands just to make her go away." That explained Susan's confidence. She'd been testing boundaries and getting away with it. As Susan laid out her imaginary authority to Frank, I realized how differently I'd react now. 5 years ago, after losing a previous house in a property dispute, I would have panicked, yelled, and made expensive calls I couldn't afford. Emotional reactions had taught me the hard way that they usually make things worse. This time I had knowledge, patience, and a plan. I pulled out my phone and hit record while Susan continued to lecture Frank about the HOA's powers. Every false claim she made mattered. Each word was evidence. She was effectively confessing to a planned grab while I documented it. Sometimes the smartest move is to let your opponent dig their own grave while you quietly hold the shovel. Frank was explaining basic property law when I interrupted, calm and precise. "Susan, I appreciate your enthusiasm for community improvement. Can you point me to the statute that grants HOA president's authority over non-member private property?" She blinked, clearly unprepared for a legal challenge. The surveyor began packing up. "A smart move," He'd recognized a liability when he saw one. Adopting that condescending tone she used with new residents, Susan answered, "Mr. Grant, I understand property law can be confusing for laypeople, but as HOA president I have broad discretionary powers for community betterment. Your parents' old lot has been vacant too long and needs development." She gestured at the land like it was abandoned, not my legal inheritance. I held up the deed for everyone to see. "This land was inherited," I said. "It predates your HOA by 17 years. You have about as much authority over my property as the mayor of Dallas has over a farm in Oklahoma." The county official suddenly found his clipboard fascinating. Frank nodded. Mrs. Chen murmured, "I knew it." To her small dog, Susan's expression cooled from confident to calculating. I could see her thinking through how to salvage the plan without admitting she was wrong. "Well, we'll see about that," she said at last. "I'll be consulting with our HOA attorney about abandoned property statutes and community safety issues." Then she walked away, leaving her crew to follow. As she retreated toward the subdivision, I stood on my parents' land and felt, for the first time in a long time, that I wasn't going to be pushed off it quietly. She believed she had authority she plainly didn't, as something that should have worried me, but didn't. That mix of supreme confidence and spectacular ignorance promised she'd do something monumentally stupid. I planned to be there with my camera when she did. The next morning I was surprised to find Peterson's car parked at the county building department. Most people would have broken ground after being challenged, but she seemed determined to paper her scheme into legitimacy. I parked across the street and watched through the glass doors as she argued with a clerk. Her gestures grew more frantic as each conversation escalated. Frank had mentioned he needed to renew his contractor's license that same day, so I texted him Peterson's location. He showed up 20 minutes later and we watched her trade increasingly heated words with higher-level county staff. Whatever she wanted, it wasn't going well. After an hour she stormed out empty-handed, cheeks flushed with the kind of anger that comes when someone who thinks they're untouchable is told they're wrong. Frank went inside to sort his license renewal while I waited in the lot. When he came back he had confirmation of my suspicions. I asked my buddy Tom what she wanted. He said with a grin, "She tried to get permits for construction on land she doesn't own." Tom had explained that deeds must apply for permits. Peterson argued HOA presidents have community development authority. Tom laughed and told her no HOA in Texas and no HOA has power over non-member private estates. That afternoon a pickup pulled up in my driveway. A middle-aged man in work clothes approached, clearly uneasy. "Excuse me, sir, are you the owner here?" I nodded. He glanced around before continuing, "I'm the contractor Mrs. Peterson hired for this project. I need to ask you something important." He unrolled his plans on his truck hood with shaking hands. "She told me we were building a community wellness center, but these blueprints show a private residence, a master suite, gourmet kitchen, 3-car garage, wine cellar. I've built dozens of community centers, none of them had walk-in closets and luxury baths." His fear was real. The liability dawned on him as he spoke. "She keeps talking community development and HOA authority, but I'm starting to think we're part of something illegal. I don't want my company tied to unauthorized construction or fraud." Smart contractor. He'd seen what Peterson hadn't. I showed him the deed and inheritance paperwork. His face went pale as the scope of her deception hit him. "Jesus Christ," he said. "She told me the HOA owned this land and had full development rights. She even showed me fake permits and authorization letters." He rolled up the blueprints with disgust. "I'm calling my insurance company and my lawyer right now. This could ruin my business." Instead of folding after losing her contractor, Peterson switched to financial attack. My phone began ringing non-stop. Calls from my homeowner's insurer, the mortgage lender, and the county tax office, all asking about reported pending construction and liability on my property. The barrage was a punch to the gut. Each ring tightened my chest and dragged up memories of losing my last house 5 years earlier. Laura watched me field call after call, worry deepening on her face with every exchange. The insurance rep was confused by conflicting reports. The mortgage officer sounded alarmed about unauthorized work that could affect our loan. By evening the stress had me reliving those old legal battles and financial manipulations that had cost me everything. After the 7th call, Laura pulled me aside, voice tight. "Jonathan, She's not just attacking our property, she's trying to destroy our financial standing and credit. This feels exactly like 5 years ago. I'm scared we aren't ready for this level of coordinated assault. Her fear made me glad I'd documented everything. That evening Peterson showed up at our door with her husband, a manila folder, and the kind of determined expression people wear when they think they've found a silver bullet. Her husband looked awkward, like he'd been dragged into something against his judgment and was beginning to see the consequences. She thrust the folder at me without preamble. "Mr. Grant, I've discovered significant financial irregularities requiring immediate HOA intervention for community protection and safety." Inside were fabricated documents claiming my taxes were delinquent and that liens and assessments totaling $12,000 had been filed. The paperwork looked official at first glance but bore amateur errors anyone familiar with tax records would spot: mismatched numbers, formats not used by the county, charges far beyond any HOA remit. Mrs. Chen, walking her dog, paused nearby and watched Peterson explain increasingly convoluted financial theories to justify retroactive billing for services we never requested. Frank appeared as if drawn by the smell of nonsense, took one look at the paperwork, and if Frank took one look at the documents and instantly recognized the fraud. "Ma'am, these tax records are fake, the formatting is wrong, the assessment numbers don't match county systems, and HOA liens can't exceed actual services provided." With decades of building department experience, his authority made Peterson's forgery obvious to everyone standing there. Laura stepped outside to see the commotion, immediately spotting the fraud herself. Her legal training gave her questions sharp enough to cut straight through Peterson's story. By the time Peterson and her husband walked away, I realized she'd just handed me her biggest mistake yet, a physical evidence of forgery and financial fraud. Her web of lies was unraveling, each desperate move creating more proof for prosecutors. Frank stayed to discuss what we'd seen, his expression grim. He explained the criminal implications of Peterson's stunt and reminded me that between the contractor's confession and these forged records, I now had professional witnesses who could testify to her deception. Still, I wasn't sure whether documenting her crimes would clear my name or whether she'd find a way to twist the story against me. 2 weeks later, despite losing her contractor, Peterson brought in a new one, someone less concerned with legality and more tempted by premium emergency rates. At 6 in the morning, the roar of machinery shook me awake. Bulldozers tore through soil and trees that had stood for decades. From my window, I watched as the HOA president stood proudly in a hard hat, directing crews as if she owned the land. She had decided to gamble on brute possession, betting that visible progress would lend her authority after the fact. I called Frank immediately. He arrived with his camera and measuring tape, both of us standing at the property line documenting the trespass. "Every hour they work racks up damages and liability," he said while photographing the destruction of my parents' garden. "She thinks speed will bury the law, but she's actually building the case against herself." The crew moved with striking efficiency, a clear evidence Peterson had paid for speed over compliance. By noon, a huge section was cleared and the foundation work had started. It wasn't a wellness center at all, and the design was obviously a luxury residence. Neighbors began gathering to watch. Some were curious about the scale of the project, others uneasy about the noise and the glaring legal issues. Peterson seized on the attention, mingling like a politician at a rally. She handed out flyers, described the wellness facilities, and promised the build would raise property values. Then the dynamic shifted. Councilman Rick Torres arrived unannounced, his presence giving the event a veneer of legitimacy. Peterson had clearly invited him, knowing an elected official's support would sway the crowd. Torres, facing re-election in 6 months, needed endorsements from homeowner groups. Peterson had promised him unified backing from 3 associations if he supported her developments at calculated trade. She used the moment to give a full speech, her voice ringing with borrowed authority. "This wellness center represents the kind of forward-thinking development that separates premier communities from the ordinary," she declared, gesturing to the excavators behind her. "Property values will climb, recreational opportunities will expand, and Willowbrook will become a model neighborhood for sustainable planning and innovative governance." The crowd murmured approvingly, the rumble of machines underscoring her promises. Torres echoed her points with polished political rhetoric about growth and prosperity. He carefully avoided any mention of property rights, but his presence alone suggested municipal approval. Mrs. Peterson shows the innovative leadership our communities need, he said. Sometimes progress means making tough choices and overcoming resistance from those who fear change. I could feel the crowd shifting, their doubts replaced with visions of higher home values and new amenities. If I stayed silent, her narrative would cement itself. I raised my voice, ready to confront the story head-on before it hardened into fact. The question directed at Councilman Torres, who actually owns the land where this construction was happening, dropped the crowd into an awkward silence. Neighbors looked back and forth between him and me, searching for some legal explanation for the spectacle unfolding before them. Torres slid into a practiced politician's non-answer, talking about how complex development projects involve multiple stakeholders and legal frameworks that require expert interpretation. It was the kind of answer meant to soothe, not to clarify. Frank stepped forward, invoking his building department credentials to back my claims. His professional authority carried weight with those who understood the importance of correct permitting and code compliance. This is happening without permits on private property, he said plainly. Every code violation piles up by the hour. The finished structure will need full inspection and remediation before any occupancy permit could be issued. But technical truth had less pull with the crowd than Torres's polished promises and Peterson's vision of neighborhood transformation. Peterson went on the attack, trying to discredit Frank as an obstructionist blocking progress. The crowd slowly thinned as construction noise made conversation impossible and many residents chose to avoid the political friction. A few privately voiced support for my position, whispering worries about liability and property rights. Others seemed genuinely persuaded by Peterson's pitch in the councilman's presence. The neighborhood split into factions: property rights defenders on one side, development enthusiasts on the other. Exactly the kind of cleavage that makes resolution harder and emotions run hotter. That night Laura and I stood on the porch watching the equipment parked on our land like an occupying force, floodlights carving the darkness as concrete was poured around the clock. She's committed now, Laura said, voice taut. Each day that passed increased Peterson's financial stake and legal exposure, which made her more determined to justify the project by any means and therefore more unpredictable. She'd crossed a point of no return. I wondered if my method of careful documentation would be enough against someone prepared to flout the law. After dinner Frank knocked on our door with unsettling intelligence from his municipal contacts. The councilman's support had political calculations behind it. Torres was up for re-election and needed endorsements from homeowner groups. Peterson had promised him consolidated backing from several associations in exchange for his visible support. What looked like community improvement was entangled with vote trading and favors. The corruption reached beyond Peterson to elected officials willing to sacrifice legal compliance and individual rights for political convenience. Everything felt like it would come to a head the next day, and I still didn't know whether I was the neighborhood's defender or simply an obstacle to someone else's agenda. The morning after construction began, the assault became economic as well as physical. At 7 a.m. my phone rang as the first of many calls from my homeowner's insurance asking about liability for ongoing construction. Within an hour my kitchen table had turned into command central. Mortgage officers, tax assessors, utility companies, and code enforcement all phoning with anonymous reports of unauthorized development and safety violations. The barrage felt orchestrated, each ring tightening the knot in my stomach and dragging up memories I'd been trying to bury. The memories of losing my last home 5 years ago came crashing back like a nightmare I couldn't outrun. Laura sat beside me, watching as I answered call after call, her face tightening with every conversation. "Jonathan, this feels exactly like before," she whispered during a rare pause between the phone ringing. The timing, the coordination, the way they're hitting every week's quota. We've seen this playbook already. She's not just going after our land, she's dismantling our financial stability, piece by piece. Her words reminded me why I had been meticulous about documentation this time, but also drove home how much more dangerous Peterson was than I had originally believed. By noon, 3 inspectors had already appeared unannounced at my door, clipboards loaded with complaints ranging from septic issues to electrical hazards. The county building inspector looked the most exasperated, quickly realizing he'd been dragged into a personal vendetta. "Mr. Grant," he said firmly, "someone is filing systematic false reports to trigger costly inspections and possibly condemn your home. That's abuse of process, and when people weaponize our department like this, we take it seriously." Even with his reassurance, the stress began to gnaw at me, dredging up memories of the legal traps and financial ruin I had endured years ago when I didn't understand my rights. Every knock at the door, every official car in the driveway, every clipboard made me relive that past collapse. Laura found me later at the kitchen table, staring at a stack of dismissed reports. She rested her hand on my shoulder. "You're not who you were back then," she reminded me gently. "This time you know your rights. You have a plan." Don't let her games drag you back into that fear. But Peterson's tactics escalated further. False reports were suddenly landing with federal agencies, accusing me of hidden rental income, tax evasion, even unlicensed business activity. The allegations were baseless, but they forced me into time-consuming, costly defenses. Each false filing carried potential criminal implications if mishandled. That was the real weapon: endless paperwork, endless stress, and the looming threat of one misstep turning into real consequences. Laura called our attorney, laying out the campaign for what it was: malicious harassment through false reporting. "She's filed dozens of fraudulent complaints," Laura explained. "Every single one is a crime." The attorney agreed, noting it was criminal harassment and abuse of process, though proving intent would demand exhaustive documentation. By late afternoon, the fire department trolled in over supposed propane violations and fire hazards. They found nothing, but the fire marshal's anger was unmistakable. "Someone is using false emergency reports to target you," he said after finishing his inspection. "That's not just harassment, it's a crime. We'll be reporting this." Ironically, Peterson's campaign was beginning to backfire. Inspectors and officials she thought she could manipulate were turning against her, seeing the abuse for what it was. Still, the damage campaign was relentless. Credit inquiries appeared on my reports, mortgage payments were flagged as disputed, and lenders received calls questioning our ownership and alleging fraud. The level of coordination was sophisticated, suggesting Peterson had been laying the groundwork for weeks. When my mortgage company sent out an emergency investigator, they too found no violations, only more proof of deliberate lies. "Someone is systematically contacting financial institutions with fabricated claims," the investigator explained. "This isn't random. It's coordinated fraud meant to damage your financial standing. We'll be forwarding our findings to authorities." The irony wasn't lost on me. Peterson thought she was burying me under chaos, but all she was doing was building my case. I told Laura as we sorted through piles of dismissed reports and inspector notes, "Let her keep going. Every false claim is another piece of evidence. She thinks she's overwhelming us, but she's really nailing her own coffin shut." That evening, the doorbell rang. Peterson stood there with a smug grin, handing me a stack of restraining order papers. According to her, Laura and I were now a threat to community safety and HOA operations. She clearly believed this legal intimidation would finally break us. I closed the door behind her, looked at the papers in my hand, and felt a slow smile spread across my face. She had no idea how much evidence she was gifting me with every lie. Instead of waiting for her to strike again, I chose to go on the offensive. With Frank's expertise and Laura's legal training, we began building our own case. 3 days into the construction, Frank and I sat in his garage surrounded by stacks of bylaws, contracts, and HOA records spread across his workbench. Any expenditure over $500 requires board approval and member notification, Frank pointed out, tapping the governing documents. If she's using HOA funds for this project, she's not just violating procedure, she's committing embezzlement. That was the spark of our counterattack plan: trace the money, expose the fraud, and turn every one of Peterson's moves into evidence against her. The non-profit disclosure requirements exposed exactly what I had feared and provided the undeniable proof we needed to reveal Peterson's corruption. She had funneled $47,000 of community funds into her so-called wellness center without proper approval. The records detailed architectural designs, construction deposits, legal retainers, and equipment rentals at all expenditures far beyond her authority as HOA president. Laura went through the documents with her sharp legal eye and immediately identified multiple breaches of nonprofit governance rules. "This isn't just reckless spending," she explained, pointing to unauthorized line items. "This is deliberate embezzlement, a community money diverted for personal gain, disguised as a neighborhood project. Every unauthorized payment counts as a separate crime." Rather than just cataloging Peterson's misconduct, I began rallying my neighbors one by one with the shocking evidence. The first person I approached was Mrs. Chen. Her reaction confirmed my instincts. "We pay $600 a year for streets and common spaces, not luxury mansions masked as community centers," she said after reviewing the paperwork. "If Peterson is stealing our money, every single homeowner deserves to know right away." Her outrage spread quickly, and within days she had alerted half the neighborhood, who were equally furious. I assembled a detailed packet of evidence and contacted local media, knowing that public scrutiny would strike harder than a private legal dispute. Channel 7's investigative journalist, Sarah Martinez, arrived within hours, cameras already rolling as she filmed the illegal construction on my property and interviewed neighbors. "Abuses of HOA authority impact thousands of homeowners across Texas," she said while documenting Peterson's so-called Villa Foundation. "This case highlights serious issues of governance and the protection of individual rights." The media firestorm was immediate. City officials, who had stayed silent before, were now forced to take visible positions. Councilman Torres, once a vocal supporter of Peterson, suddenly vanished from the spotlight and refused to comment. His political cover evaporated under the glare of TV cameras exposing theft and financial irregularities. Peterson was left politically stranded, just when she needed allies the most. The evening broadcast featured stunned neighbors, speaking openly about how their dues had been stolen. To build on the momentum, I organized community meetings outside Peterson's control, using Frank's garage as a neutral space. There, Laura explained the difference between legitimate HOA authority and outright criminal abuse. Peterson has broken her fiduciary duty, stolen community funds, and committed multiple felonies all while claiming to act for the neighborhood's good, she told growing crowds of worried homeowners. This campaign, grounded in facts rather than anger, fueled genuine political opposition. My formal complaint prompted the district attorney's office to launch a full investigation. Prosecutor David Kim began interviewing board members and combing through financial records. These irregularities appear to be systematic embezzlement of nonprofit funds for personal benefit, he told me during our first meeting. "We're treating this as a serious white-collar crime with potential federal consequences." Hearing those words confirmed that my careful documentation had been worth it. The case was no longer just a personal battle, it was a criminal investigation with the full weight of law enforcement behind it. Peterson's own lawyer, from Henderson Walsh Associates, withdrew representation after reviewing the evidence and recognizing just how deep her legal jeopardy ran. Her lawyer bowed out after reading the pile of evidence I'd put together. Professional attorneys avoid clients whose guilt is both obvious and well documented, especially when the story has gone public. "We can't ethically represent someone where criminal activity is apparent," he told me. Legal abandonment left Peterson scrambling for counsel. Inspectors began arriving daily at the site after I filed detailed violation reports and handed over proof of unauthorized construction on private land. Each visit produced formal findings, specific code breaches that would require expensive remediation before any occupancy could be considered. I wasn't passively waiting for enforcement. I was actively coordinating investigations, supplying evidence, and making sure nothing was overlooked. The building officials appreciated having an informed complainant who understood codes and procedures. Federal bank fraud investigators reached out after I reported Peterson's use of falsified property documents to secure construction financing from national lenders. Her forged ownership papers and fabricated permits pulled the case into federal jurisdiction because she had presented fraudulent documentation to institutions operating across state lines. The investigator laid it out bluntly. Peterson's loan applications contained material misrepresentations about property ownership and authority, And when national banks are defrauded, it becomes a federal matter with potential prison exposure measured in decades. The escalation to federal charges was precisely the outcome I'd hoped to trigger. As Peterson's political cover crumbled and her criminal exposure multiplied, I watched evening news segments that confirmed how effective an offensive, documented approach could be. Rather than react to each new attack, I dismantled her power by turning every lie into evidence and every corruption claim into an official investigation, a coordinated action that left her isolated and legally exposed. The reporter's closing words echoed exactly what I wanted the public to hear. Tomorrow, Peterson wouldn't just be battling me as the homeowner she tried to defraud, she'd be facing the entire city. She scheduled her villa's grand opening for the weekend, but I had already arranged something else for the very same day. An emergency HOA board meeting designed to expose her corruption in front of the people she claimed to represent. More than 60 residents crowded into the community center. Unlike past gatherings, this wasn't a casual debate. I had spent the entire week preparing neighbors' testimonies, compiling documents, and organizing the presentation so it would resemble a legal case rather than a neighborhood quarrel. I opened by distributing copies of financial records showing $47,000 in unauthorized spending. Every homeowner deserves to know how their dues were misused without permission, I said, watching faces harden as people silently calculated how much of their money had gone into Peterson's pocket. The mood shifted immediately. Some residents folded the papers with shaking hands, others whispered frantic numbers to their spouses, while a few nodded grimly as the truth of Peterson's scheme sank in. A board member broke the silence, warning of fiduciary responsibility and the very real threat of lawsuits for negligent oversight. The weight of her words left several members declaring they would resign unless Peterson provided a full accounting and halted all unauthorized activity at once. Peterson tried to regain control, but her usual commanding tone faltered. Even her loyalists exchanged uneasy looks as the evidence stacked against her. Then came the testimonies. Mrs. Chen stood with visible anger. Peterson came to my house 3 times, pressuring me to sign statements saying Laura Grant was unstable and dangerous. She wanted me to file false reports with county health services. When I refused, she threatened to raise my HOA dues. The room erupted in murmurs. Then Mr. Rodriguez rose, his voice heavy with shame. I believed her promises about higher property values and better amenities. I even donated extra for her wellness center. Now I see I was financing the theft of my neighbor's land. Councilman Torres, once one of Peterson's biggest champions, now read it carefully. Community development must follow proper procedures and receive resident approval, he said, distancing himself from her collapsing empire. His sudden caution signaled the loss of her political shield. Frank followed with professional clarity, presenting documented building code violations and emphasizing safety risks. His authority carried weight. At that exact moment, a county building inspector entered the room, delivering stop work orders and violation notices for the unpermitted construction. The timing was no accident. I had coordinated it so the announcement would strike at the peak of the meeting. This construction must cease immediately until ownership disputes and permit issues are resolved, he declared firmly. Peterson's response exposed just how disconnected from reality she had become. This inspector has no authority over community development projects, she snapped, her denial ringing hollow against the stack of official documents in plain view. Councilman Torres kept his distance, carefully backing away from the controversy that he once championed. Community development requires legal process and resident approval, he said, his diplomatic tone barely masking the fear of being tied to obvious corruption. With his retreat, Peterson's last thread of political protection snapped. Frank stepped forward with precise technical reports, presenting code violations and safety hazards that gave undeniable weight to the case. His credibility silenced any suggestion that the concerns were exaggerated. Right on cue, a county inspector entered, handing Peterson official stop work orders and notices for unpermitted construction. The timing was no accident. I had coordinated it to ensure maximum impact. This construction must cease immediately until ownership disputes and permit approvals are resolved, he declared. Peterson's response revealed just how far detached from reality she had become. This inspector has no authority over community development projects, she snapped, insisting her so-called wellness center operated under different regulations. Her denial drew gasps from residents. Even her remaining supporters took a step back, visibly shaken by her brazen defiance. At the back of the room, a representative from the district attorney's office quietly took notes. His presence alone demanded respect, and when he finally spoke, silence fell. This isn't a neighborhood dispute. What we are documenting here is systematic fraud, embezzlement, and theft. This is criminal investigation territory now. The atmosphere transformed instantly. What began as a community meeting had turned into a criminal proceeding in front of cameras and witnesses. Television crews poured in, documenting both the heated meeting and the construction site. Reporters repeated the story for a wider audience. And a drama-nest authority abuse was not an isolated issue, it was part of a statewide pattern that endangered homeowners everywhere. Neighbors, emboldened by the evidence, began declaring their intentions to file lawsuits demanding reimbursement for stolen funds and damages. Meanwhile, bank investigators arrived at the villa to verify collateral on loans Peterson had secured with falsified documents. My reports to multiple institutions had triggered overlapping investigations. Federal authorities were now involved, citing interstate fraud after reviewing her forged ownership papers and fraudulent loan applications. I had achieved exactly what I intended. Local, state, and federal investigators, the district attorney, inspectors, and the media were all aligned, applying pressure from every direction. There was no escape route left. When Peterson's construction crew showed up despite the stop work orders, the confrontation was immediate. Law enforcement officials and inspectors swarmed the property while television cameras captured every detail. The site made it clear. This was no longer just about one corrupt HOA president, it was about accountability on every level. Peterson stood inside the unfinished foundation of her so-called villa, her smile gone, her supporters scattered, and her exposure growing with every passing minute. Tonight, she still stood in her stolen house. Tomorrow, she might be standing in chains. The irony hit its peak at her grand opening party. About 30 guests, HOA members, realtors, and local officials mingled as she welcomed them in a silk dress, parading through the villa like a triumphant leader. The home itself was stunning, with polished hardwood, granite counters, and luxury finishes that most neighbors could never afford. I entered with Laura, Frank, and 3 undercover officers, all recording evidence. Peterson's smile faltered briefly, but she pressed on, trying to project confidence. She gave tours as though the house were hers, as though sheer performance could rewrite reality. That's when I raised my voice above the chatter. "Thank you, Peterson, for building such a beautiful house on my land," I declared, holding up my deed, inheritance papers, and county property records for everyone to see. The room went dead silent. Laura stepped forward, presenting the stunned crowd with her legal expertise and a mountain of documentation exposing Peterson's systematic crimes. "What Peterson has done here isn't a zoning dispute or community misunderstanding," she explained evenly. "We're looking at multiple felonies: criminal trespassing, embezzlement, forgery, and bank fraud. Each carries serious prison time under Texas law." Frank followed with his professional breakdown of the building code violations and permit irregularities. His calm, technical explanation only deepened the unease among Peterson's guests. A few slipped quietly toward their cars, realizing they'd walked into the middle of a criminal case rather than a celebration. Then, a representative from the district attorney's office stepped forward. "Mrs. Peterson," she declared firmly, "you're under arrest for embezzlement, fraud, trespassing, and conspiracy to commit bank fraud." Deputies closed in with swift precision as television cameras captured the entire scene. The sharp snap of handcuffs echoed in the villa's marble foyer. Peterson's carefully crafted hostess smile collapsed into panic as Miranda rights were read aloud. Federal agents soon joined, serving additional warrants tied to her forged bank documents. "These federal charges alone carry up to 30 years in prison," the lead agent explained, ensuring every witness understood the gravity. The party unraveled as guests scattered, avoiding being caught on camera. I wandered through the villa as the arrest unfolded, studying each luxury detail built with stolen money on my stolen land. A master bedroom larger than my parents' entire first house. A gourmet kitchen gleaming with professional appliances. A climate-controlled wine cellar designed for collectors. Imported marble. Brazilian cherry floors. Hand-carved crown molding at every element screamed wealth and craftsmanship. Ironically, Peterson had constructed the dream house I could never have afforded, only to lose it all in disgrace. County officials issued an immediate condemnation order, citing unpermitted construction and hazardous code violations that required full remediation before anyone could ever live there. Peterson's financial accounts were frozen to fund restitution, while neighbors began filing sworn statements about her intimidation, false complaints, and attempted witness tampering. As she was escorted to a patrol car, Peterson tried one last time to spin her actions. This land needed development for the community's benefit. She shouted at the cameras, but the gathered crowd no longer believed her. Neighbors approached me instead, offering apologies. "We didn't know she was building on stolen land," one longtime resident admitted, shaking his head. Camera flashes lit the twilight, freezing faces of shock, guilt, and betrayal. By the time the sirens faded, the villa stood silent, an empty monument to greed. Peterson had spent hundreds of thousands turning my inheritance into her fantasy mansion, only to trade it all for prison time. Frank couldn't help but admire the craftsmanship. "Honestly," he admitted, "she built this better than most licensed contractors." "She thought she was building her legacy," I replied quietly. "But she built mine instead." 6 months later, Peterson pleaded guilty to multiple state felonies, accepting 4 years in state prison, 2 years of federal probation, and restitution exceeding $200,000. She was permanently barred from whole leadership and stripped of all assets tied to her crimes. The villa required $150,000 in remediation just to pass inspection. Legally, it belonged to me now, but the choice remained to invest heavily in repairs or tear it down. Laura's professional reputation was fully restored once the state bar investigation confirmed Peterson's campaign of falsified complaints and forged documents. Several attorneys even issued public apologies for believing Peterson's lies. Her harassment campaign was deliberate and systematic, the investigator explained. Frank was soon elected HOA president, vowing transparency and oversight. His reforms included quarterly reports, mandatory member approval for any expense over $1,000, and independent audits of all accounts. The community itself, however, remained divided, some still bitter over the loss of funds, others ashamed they had once defended Peterson's lies. One evening, while I was checking the villa's foundation, Mrs. Chen approached me with her face full of regret. "I almost signed the papers she pushed on me," she whispered. "If I had, my false testimony could have destroyed your family." I keep thinking how close we all came to being dragged into her crimes. Her words mirrored what many in the neighborhood felt: as shame, guilt, and the heavy realization that they had nearly been accomplices in Peterson's scheme. The investigation later confirmed that Peterson had siphoned over $60,000 of home money for her personal use, legal fees, vacations, luxury shopping beyond what she funneled into the illegal construction. Board members who failed in their duty of oversight soon faced civil lawsuits as residents sought to recover lost funds and damages caused by negligence. Ironically, property values in Willowbrook rose after Peterson's downfall, since buyers were attracted to the stronger accountability and transparency measures now in place. Councilman Torres wasn't so lucky. His re-election bid collapsed when voters turned to a candidate who promised to protect property rights and demand accountability from officials. The election results were a clear rejection of leaders who ignored the law for convenience. Law schools began citing the case as a textbook example of the limits of HOA authority and the importance of following due process in community development. Media outlets covered it widely, framing it as a story of abuse of power, homeowners' rights, and the dangers of unchecked authority. Even federal banking rules changed after the case, closing loopholes that had allowed Peterson to secure fraudulent construction loans with falsified property documents. Her crimes revealed just how vulnerable lending systems were when criminals hid behind the appearance of community leadership. Eventually, after code compliance was completed, the villa became our family home. A luxury I could never have built honestly now stood on my land, Legally mine at last. Laura took joy in arranging furniture in the grand rooms Peterson once designed for herself. I quietly admired the construction quality, which far exceeded my own original plans. Frank organized a neighborhood watch not to patrol crime, but to monitor governance. He trained residents to recognize financial irregularities, signs of abuse of power, and the red flags of corruption. Prevention is better than prosecution, he said, leading workshops on resident rights and accountability. The precedent spread. Across Texas, other HOA officials faced prosecution after residents became emboldened to challenge shady practices. Willowbrook's fight tripled outward, protecting homeowners statewide. Laura slowly returned to legal consulting, focusing on HOA disputes and property rights. Her ordeal with Peterson gave her unique expertise, which she now used to defend others. Nobody should ever go through what we did, she told her first client. The final truth about Peterson's motives came later. Her villa design was copied from luxury homes she'd admired in wealthy neighborhoods where she could never afford to live legitimately. Her crimes weren't about community development at all. They were about envy and entitlement. Sometimes, late at night, I sit in the master bedroom she built for herself, holding the yellow deed my parents signed in 1978. The marble bathroom, once meant for her indulgence, now reminds me that justice has its own strange way of unfolding. The closet she designed for stolen designer clothes holds only my father's old work shirts and my mother's handmade quilts, items of modesty, but filled with more integrity than all of Peterson's wealth-driven lies. As I signed the final occupancy permits in the same county office where the battle began, I reflected on the bigger lesson. Property law exists to protect against exactly this kind of abuse. And more than that, it shows how patient documentation, steady persistence, and organized community action can topple even the most entrenched abuse of power. Now, standing on the villa's deck, overlooking peaceful land once scarred by conflict, I finally feel something I thought I'd lost forever: peace. Peterson's attempt to steal through intimidation left behind something far bigger than a prison sentence. It left a precedent, proof that arrogance always collapses under the weight of the law. The villa isn't just a house, it's a monument to persistence, a reminder that no empire built on lies will stand. And with that, from all of us here at Anadramanest, thank you for being part of this journey. Don't forget to drop a comment, hit that like button, and join us again for more unbelievable stories.